It's the most despicable thing I've ever heard in my life. Men of honor don't do this.
Men of honor don't do this?
You don't do this. You don't throw people overboard.
That's a clip from 60 Minutes tonight where former CIA Director George Tenet charges the Bush administration made him the scapegoat when no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. And it's time now for our Sunday gang. Britt Hume, Washington managing editor of Fox News, and Fox News contributors Mara Liasson of National Public Radio, Bill Kristol of the Weekly Standard, and Juan Williams, also from National Public Radio. Well, in his new book, Tenet says that the White House greatly inflated the significance of his slam dunk remark in 2002 to make it seem as if that were the tipping point for the decision to go to war when he claims it wasn't. Even more damaging, he writes this, and let's put it up on the screen. There never was a serious debate that I know of within the administration about the imminence of the Iraq threat. Britt, what do you make of Tenet's account?
Well, several things. First of all, I don't think he was made a scapegoat. He was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which I think is like the highest civic honor that can be bestowed on somebody. A lot of people wondered about that in light of the obvious failure on weapons of mass destruction, failure of intelligence. I think he's probably right that the slam dunk comment was not central to the president's conclusions, that it was a conclusion about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, almost universally held among every intelligence service in the world and across the U.S. government and across several administrations. It was, to put it mildly, the consensus view. I don't think that he can be sure of his comments that there was never a serious debate. People who were in the administration say there was roiling debate, not always within his earshot, beforehand. So I think he may be factually wrong about that. Chris, though, the most important things that he said in that book were not about any of this. They were about the effect and the effectiveness of the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, which have been so controversial.
We'll get back to that in a minute, but let me ask you about it, because I have to say, Mara, it seems to me that the slam dunk remark was used by George W. Bush in his conversations with Bob Woodward, was used by Vice President Cheney in some of his interviews, as if that was, in effect, the smoking gun.
Well, that's clearly what Tenet is angry about. He seems to say they're hanging this all on me. I don't know if that's true. I mean, there were a lot of things that they pointed to, including, as Britt says, the consensus of previous administrations and other countries' intelligence about this. But what's interesting is, the joke about Washington Memoirs is that the subtitle is always, if only they'd listen to me. Well, in this book, it sounds like he's saying they really didn't listen to me. They were going to go to war anyway. And what he's trying to do is downplay the importance of this slam dunk remark, which really came to life through Bob Woodward. It sounds like that's where his anger it is directed.
Well,
it should be directed
Bob Woodward
mostly
from the President
of the United States, but made that into this kind of central moment that the war would not have happened if he had not said that, and I think that's probably
Bill, let's pick up on this question of whether they were waiting or whether they were ready to go to war under any circumstances. Tenet says in the book that there was a push long before 9/11 by Vice President Cheney, by Paul Wolfowitz, by Doug Feith, among others, to take down Saddam Hussein and set up a beachhead, a democratic beachhead in the Middle East. And he, in effect, says it was the neocon agenda.
There was a push by Bill Clinton and to take down Saddam Hussein and to not recognize the legitimacy of his regime. I believe we had sanctions and no-fly zones, which President Bush inherited. But of course, a lot of us thought Saddam should be removed, and I imagine Paul Wolfowitz and Doug Feith did. It turns out that George Tenet, in addition to being a mediocre CIA director, is a crybaby. I mean, can you believe that clip on 60 Minutes you showed? Oh, it's so disgusting that people are criticizing him. It's hurting his reputation. Give me a break. In this book, as part of his attack on Doug Feith, one of the notorious neocons there, he describes some subordinate of Feith's, a woman named Tina Shelton, coming over and giving what he describes as a ridiculous presentation to the CIA. He mischaracterizes her. He says she's a Navy reservist as a way of dismissing her. In fact, I've never met her, but I gather she's a 22-year veteran of the Defense Intelligence Agency. She denies that she says what Feith characterizes her as saying, and Feith has no. What Tenet characterizes her as saying. Tenet has no notes of the occasion. So he gratuitously slanders other people, much lower-ranking people, like this woman, Tina Shelton.
But forgive me, there are bigger issues here than Tina Shelton.
No, but it shows something. I mean, this is a book written because he got the Medal of Freedom from President Bush. He could have said something. If he thought things were going really wrong, he could have said something in 2003, 2004. Some of us were arguing for more troops in Iraq in late 2003. Where was Tenet? He was loyally part of the Bush team. Now he doesn't like what's happened, so he distances himself.
Yeah, let me ask you, and we're seeing here the president putting the Medal of Freedom on around George Tenet's neck in December of 2004. Incidentally, several months after the slam dunk story came out in Woodward's book. What do you make of all of this? What do you make of the fact that they gave him the Medal of Freedom? Was it an effort to keep Tenet inside the tent, which ultimately failed?
Well, I think that's exactly right. Because they gave it to Bremer, they gave it to Tenet. Bremer and Tenet now come out with books highly critical of the way that this war has been conducted. And I think if you look back on it, what strikes me is that the real nugget in here is that weapons of mass destruction had nothing to do with the reason to go to war. According to Tenet, the reason was to seek regime change as part of transforming the Middle East and as part of putting the U.S. in position to have greater control over Middle East politics and protect Israel. That's what he says. That's to me what it looks like a false face was put forward to the American people, and he says the slam dunk comment was in relation to being able to persuade the American people about connections that existed, but not specifically with regard to weapons of mass destruction.
But what about Bill's point that if all of that is the case, why did he wait until he wrote a book and got a multi-million-dollar advance in 2007? Why didn't he speak up earlier?
Well, I guess he felt that it's interesting in the book, as someone pointed out, he takes a lot of shots at people who are ranked down, including this lady that Bill was referring to, but also Condoleezza Rice and the like. But he doesn't take much shots at the president himself, and maybe he felt he was part of the team. He had been part of the Clinton team, he was part of the Bush team, and he always focused on being loyal to that leadership. Maybe that's what he thought he was doing. Maybe he was grateful that President Bush didn't force him out when President Bush came on board. He'd been Clinton's CIA director.
He says in the book that the enhanced interrogation techniques, which have been derided by some as torture, nobody really knows for sure what these techniques are. Those who are involved in the programs, including Tenet, insist they do not amount to torture, were more useful and more effective and more helpful in heading off terrorist plots and attacks than all the other forms of intelligence combined, is what he basically says. That is an extraordinarily broad, comprehensive, and ambitious statement. It does, however, seem to reflect the attitude within the intelligence community about the efficacy of these techniques, and that is why you had this ferocious defense of them from Mike Hayden, from the president, and from all others involved. I think that is a very important point, and Tenet, who I think more highly of than perhaps others at this table, deserves to be heard on that and listened to carefully, because it was in a position and at the time at least was in a position to know.
Mara, let's pivot to where, excuse me, not to Iraq 6 years ago, but Iraq today, and this is going to be a very busy week. The Congress is going to send the president the Iraq war spending bill with these goals for getting out. He's going to veto it. He's called congressional leaders up to meet with him on Wednesday. Meanwhile, there are new reports that we're going to be in Iraq well into 2008, according to the generals, and that we're scaling back our expectations for what Mali can achieve. Where does all this add up, and what does it leave us?
This is the moment that we've all been waiting for, which is, what happens after the veto. This part was absolutely expected and inevitable, and the Democrats at this moment have dug themselves in pretty firmly. They feel they have public opinion on their side. Majorities say they want the war to end, and they're comfortable with a kind of timeline or deadline. But they're going to have to negotiate something. And it's very possible, and you've heard some talk about this, that a final bill would include some kind of benchmarks. What the consequences of not meeting them would be, I don't know, but some kind of benchmarks without the timeline and deadline, and that's something that the president could sign. And then the Democrats just feel like, okay, we won this issue politically, but we also funded the troops.
Bill, does the president have to compromise here? I mean, even on the idea of non-binding benchmarks, or should he just say, clean bill, that's it?
Well, they may have to compromise a bit because he is the commander-in-chief and has an obligation to get funds to these troops. And it is hurting not having the funds in Iraq. There are things that aren't being purchased that should be purchased. There's training of the Iraqi army that's not happening now because the Democrats have held up this supplemental. The president is a responsible commander-in-chief. He will accept some compromises as long as they don't fundamentally limit his ability to do what he has to do and get the funds over there.
All right. Where are the Republicans?
Republicans want a clean supplemental bill to fund the troops.
I think Republicans have abdicated all sense of responsibility in this war. It's as if they're just practicing party politics instead of acting in a way to defend the interests of the United States.
All right, you can continue this conversation during the commercial.